If you're starting a company, if you're the founder, entrepreneur starting a company, you always want to aim for monopoly, and you want to always avoid competition. And so, hence, competition is for losers. Something we'll be talking about today.
The Chinese company DeepSeek has shaken up the global debate about artificial intelligence. It was assumed for years that the United States was leading the world in the development of AI technology, and that US big tech corporations based in Silicon Valley would be the leaders of AI. But seemingly out of nowhere, this small Chinese company, DeepSeek, published an AI large language model that is even better than the models created by the leading US AI company, OpenAI, which is half owned by Microsoft. And what was even more incredible is that the DeepSeek model requires a tiny fraction of the computing power and the energy used by US AI models, and DeepSeek developed its model for just around $6 million US, while US companies are spending hundreds of billions of dollars per year to develop AI technology. Finally, what was most amazing of all is that DeepSeek released this model open source for free for anyone in the world to use. You can run it on your own computer at home. So in short, it is not an exaggeration to say that this was completely groundbreaking, and it has really scared a lot of big tech corporations in the United States, because the reality is they don't want competition. This once was admitted openly by the very powerful US tech billionaire Peter Thiel. He published an article in the Wall Street Journal back in 2014 titled "Competition is for Losers." And he said that tech corporations want to build a monopoly. He was proud of it.
I have a single idée fixe that I'm completely obsessed with on the business side, which is that if you're starting a company, if you're the founder, entrepreneur starting a company, you always want to aim for monopoly, and you want to always avoid competition. And so, hence, competition is for losers. Something we'll be talking about today.
And by the way, Peter Thiel is very closely linked to US President Donald Trump. He has been a funder of many right-wing Republican politicians, and the US Vice President J.D. Vance previously worked for Peter Thiel.
We're voting for Trump because we judge the leadership of our country to have failed.
So this is not some fringe billionaire. This is one of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley, admitting openly that they actually don't want competition. They want to have a monopoly, not only in the US, but around the world. And that's why they're very afraid of this increasing competition from China. And it's also why the US government is trying to restrict this Chinese technology and prevent any competition. Immediately after DeepSeek went viral and became the most popular app in the United States, the US government claimed that it's a so-called national security threat. The US Navy immediately banned the use of DeepSeek, claiming that it has security and ethical concerns. And now the US government is trying to expand its restrictions on China, starting under the first Trump administration and then continuing in the Biden administration. The US government put export restrictions, trying to prevent China from getting access to the most cutting-edge semiconductors, chips that it needs to train artificial intelligence models. And now the US government is threatening other countries, especially Singapore, and saying, if you sell any of these chips to China, we will impose heavy sanctions on you and tariffs on you and make you suffer. So Washington is getting increasingly desperate. And this is not just the Trump administration and the Republicans, it's also the Democrats. This is bipartisan. There is an obsession with trying to prevent China from technologically developing, or as the Biden administration's Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo put it, the US goal is to slow down China's rate of innovation so these US corporations in Silicon Valley have no real competition. However, what the US government is learning very quickly is that every time it tries to ban one Chinese technology, another one becomes very popular. So the US government tried to ban TikTok and tried to force the Chinese parent company of TikTok, ByteDance, to sell it to a US big tech monopoly. And what happened? Many Americans moved over to another Chinese app called Xiaohongshu, or Little Red Book, or Red Note as it's often translated. This became extremely popular as well. This was before DeepSeek, this Chinese AI app, became the most popular app in the US, overtaking OpenAI's ChatGPT. And now in Washington, the discussion is how they can try to ban DeepSeek like they tried to ban TikTok. But the reality is that DeepSeek is just the beginning. There are already many different Chinese companies developing very competitive AI models. In fact, some US venture capitalists are terrified because they're warning that China is developing 10 different top-tier AI models from not only DeepSeek, but companies like Tencent, ByteDance, Alibaba, and many other companies you've probably never even heard of. So what is the US government going to try to do? Well, this was debated at a hearing of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in Washington on the 30th of January in a hearing titled "The Malign Influence of the People's Republic of China at Home and Abroad." And in this hearing, the US Senate discussed plans to steal Chinese engineers. That's the term they use, steal Chinese engineers. So steal talent from China. And they also discussed plans to block and cut off other Chinese apps and competitors like they tried to do to TikTok. As expert testimony in this hearing, the Senate invited several former US government officials who are now working in different US government think tanks in Washington. There was a revolving door between them. One of these so-called experts was Melanie Hart, who's an extreme China hawk. She previously worked for the US State Department and oversaw the State Department semiconductor strategy, trying to block China from getting access to chips to prevent it from competing with US big tech monopolies. She's now the director of the China Hub at the Atlantic Council, which is a very hawkish think tank in Washington, funded by the US government.
Let's steal their best engineers. China's national engineers developed the DeepSeek AI model that surprised the world this week. We'd be better off if the engineers behind that were working here in the US and US universities and US companies.
Another expert who was invited to this Senate hearing is Peter Mattis. He's a CIA veteran and an extreme China hawk. He's the president of the Jamestown Foundation, which is closely linked to the CIA. It was originally founded during the first Cold War, backed by the CIA to provide jobs to right-wing dissidents from the Soviet Union who would go to the United States, and then the CIA would use this foundation to give them jobs. And this guy, Peter Mattis, who leads this very hawkish neoconservative foundation, he previously worked for the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on China. And in this Senate hearing, a senator asked him what he thinks that the U.S. government should do with these Chinese apps like DeepSeek and Red Note. And his response was that the US government should ban them and should prevent people from being able to download them in the App Store.
What should we do about Red Note and DeepSeek and other platforms like that?
I think for those kinds of platforms, you have to adopt the same approach that was applied to TikTok, that it either is sort of removed from the control or it is no longer available in the app stores.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So this is the US government's response to Chinese competition. They don't want Chinese competition. They don't want competition from anyone. They only want their big tech corporations in Silicon Valley to be global monopolies. But the narrative now being used to try to justify banning Chinese competitors is that OpenAI claims that DeepSeek was using OpenAI's models in order to develop DeepSeek's models. Now, this is hilarious on so many levels because OpenAI is notorious for basically using the entire internet, ignoring all intellectual property, and using everything, sucking it up for data to train its large language models. This has been known for years. It has been reported on in the press. OpenAI has used all of our personal information, scrubbing social media platforms, scrubbing everything on the internet. So, this is just so hypocritical. But it's also hilarious because now on Twitter, there are tons of developers who work in AI who are saying that they have evidence that OpenAI has used their models, has used their source code, has used their programming, their work in order to develop its own models. So OpenAI is accusing DeepSeek of what it has done for years. And the cherry on top of this hypocrisy, which is so funny, is that after DeepSeek went mega viral and became the most popular app in the US, ChatGPT changed its website and added chain of thought. If you use it, you can go to the bottom and there's a little light bulb and it says think, and this is chain of thought, which is based exactly on what DeepSeek did. This is why developers on Twitter are joking that they have evidence that OpenAI is training on DeepSeek's user interface. OpenAI, they just took the idea from DeepSeek, and now they're accusing DeepSeek of using their work. And there's another big irony in all of this, which is that when Peter Thiel, the tech billionaire, was invited to give a talk in 2014 at Stanford University, and his lecture was titled "Competition is for Losers," he argued in defense of monopolies. Can you guess who invited him? It was another Silicon Valley billionaire, Sam Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI.
Today's speaker is Peter Thiel. Peter was the founder of PayPal and Palantir and Founders Fund and has invested in most of the tech companies in Silicon Valley. And he's going to talk about strategy and competition. Thank you for coming, Peter.
Awesome. Thanks. Sam, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for having me.
So all of these Silicon Valley CEOs want monopolies. It's not just Peter Thiel. He's the one who said it openly, but Sam Altman of OpenAI is the one who invited him to argue in defense of monopolies against competition. And now OpenAI is complaining about Chinese competition and asking the US government to help it to restrict Chinese competition because they want a monopoly. And it's not just them. Another American tech CEO, Dario Amodei, published an article in the Wall Street Journal in January asking Donald Trump to put further restrictions on Chinese competitors so the US can maintain an AI monopoly. And he published this article in the Wall Street Journal along with co-author Matt Pottinger, who's a neoconservative China hawk, who was previously the Deputy National Security Advisor to Donald Trump in his first administration. Now, who is Dario Amodei? He is the CEO of the US AI company Anthropic, and some of the main investors in Anthropic are Amazon and Google. They have a direct partnership. So this guy, Dario Amodei, is a key part of Silicon Valley, of the AI big tech community. And in his article in the Wall Street Journal, Amodei asked Donald Trump to put more restrictions on Chinese competitors because he insisted that, quote, the US must lead the world in artificial intelligence to preserve national security, end quote. Essentially, his argument was that the US empire has to dominate the entire world. We can't allow China to have this technology because then they could challenge US hegemony, US dominance. He said that if the US dominates AI with the help of Trump restricting Chinese tech, it would provide a historic advantage for the US. He said AI will become the most powerful and strategic technology in history. He continued noting how AI technology will help to, quote, extend American military preeminence, end quote. So arguing that the Pentagon could use artificial intelligence to threaten other countries like China to maintain its global empire. And he said, quote, if they fail, another nation, most likely China, could surpass us economically and militarily, end quote. So the entire framing is about maintaining US hegemony and weakening China. And what is his solution to try to do this? He calls for export controls, which ban shipments to China of high-end chips needed to train advanced AI models. He said these are a valuable tool in slowing down China's AI development. And he noted that this is bipartisan. These restrictions started under Trump and were expanded under Biden. And now he's saying that the Trump administration, the second Trump term, should go nuclear and just put full-on restrictions, as many restrictions as possible, on China to block off all competition to US Silicon Valley monopolies. Now, that article in the Wall Street Journal was published in early January. A few weeks later, Dario Amodei, this Silicon Valley CEO backed by Amazon and Google, on his website, he published another article arguing again for stronger US export controls on China. And he specifically addressed the competition posed by DeepSeek. In this article, he was even more blatant about his goal. He said clearly that the goal is to maintain a unipolar world in which the US dominates the entire world through the use of AI technology. And he said, the question is whether China will be able to get millions of chips, which it will need in order to develop its own AI tech. And he said, if China can, we will live in a bipolar world where both the US and China have powerful AI models. But he doesn't want a bipolar world, yet alone a multipolar world. He wants a unipolar world, a global dictatorship controlled by the US with no competition. And he said, if the US puts more and more restrictions on China, and if the US prevents China from getting chips, he wrote, quote, we'll at least temporarily live in a unipolar world where only the US and its allies have these models, end quote. And then he said that, quote, in this world, the US and its allies might take a commanding and long-lasting lead on the global stage. Well-enforced export controls are the only thing that can prevent China from getting millions of chips and are therefore the most important determinant of whether we end up in a unipolar or bipolar world, end quote. So this is Silicon Valley's real goal, and we very rarely hear it stated so honestly, so openly. These powerful tech CEOs backed by Amazon and Google, they're saying they want the United States to be the unipolar power that controls the entire world. And what's so funny about this and so ironic is that these tech CEOs don't realize the implications of what they're saying because they live in a little bubble surrounded by US imperialists funded by the US government with big contracts, and they're surrounded by other big tech billionaires who have the same worldview. And at the end of his article, he warned of a, quote, authoritarian government that has committed human rights violations, has behaved aggressively on the world stage, and will be far more unfettered in these actions if they're able to match the US in AI, end quote. That quote is so funny because until the end, it sounds like he's describing the United States. The US is a police state where every year on average, police kill more than 1,000 people. The US has less than 5% of the global population, but roughly 25% of all prisoners on Earth. And we know that the US National Security Agency, the NSA, spies on everyone all around the world, including heads of state. This was exposed by the NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden over a decade ago. And what's funniest of all is this tech CEO, Dario Amodei, accuses China of behaving aggressively on the world stage. There is no country on earth that comes even remotely close to the United States when it comes to aggression on the world stage. According to the US government's own data, the US has militarily intervened in the majority of all countries on earth. From 1798 until 2022, the US carried out 469 military interventions around the world, and from 1991 until 2022, the US carried out 251 military interventions, according to official data from the US Congressional Research Service. Meanwhile, do you know what year it was the last time China was involved in a war? 1979. China has not been involved in a war for more than 45 years, and yet Silicon Valley tech CEOs are claiming China is aggressive on the world stage while arguing in support of US unipolar dominance of the planet. But in order to understand how these Silicon Valley oligarchs think, I want to go back to this article that I keep quoting from Peter Thiel, published in the Wall Street Journal in 2014, titled "Competition is for Losers," in which he calls for Silicon Valley oligarchs like him to build monopolies. I think this article very succinctly summarizes the worldview of Silicon Valley, of these big tech oligarchs who basically control the US government. Donald Trump has exposed this. He invited the world's richest billionaire oligarchs to sit with his cabinet members at his inauguration in Washington on the 20th of January. Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, who's now the world's richest man, he is one of the most powerful people in the US government. Donald Trump gave Elon Musk an office at the White House. And he was joined at the inauguration by the CEO of Meta, Mark Zuckerberg, and he was joined by the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos. Also at the inauguration was the CEO of Google and Alphabet, Sundar Pichai, and the billionaire CEO of Apple, Tim Cook. All of these big tech oligarchs became billionaires by establishing monopolies. And in this article in the Wall Street Journal, Peter Thiel said it openly. He admitted that, quote, capitalism and competition are opposites, end quote. So he's saying that he's a capitalist. He supports capitalism, but he's against competition. He's saying that capitalism is based on monopolies. He wrote, quote, capitalism is premised on the accumulation of capital. But under perfect competition, all profits get competed away, end quote. So he's saying that if companies want to maintain profits, they have to establish monopolies. Therefore, capitalism inherently tends toward the creation of monopolies. He concluded this article in the Wall Street Journal writing, quote, monopoly is the condition of every successful business, end quote. And then finally, quote, all happy companies are different. Each one earns a monopoly by solving a unique problem. All failed companies are the same. They failed to escape competition, end quote. Now, again, I need to emphasize that Peter Thiel is a major funder of politicians from the Republican Party, and he's personally very close to President Donald Trump. Trump's vice president, J.D. Vance, worked for Peter Thiel, and when J.D. Vance ran for Senate in Ohio in 2022, Peter Thiel funded his campaign with $15 million. And Peter Thiel and Elon Musk have been friends and business partners going back decades. In fact, Thiel and Musk are both part of what's known as the PayPal Mafia, which is a loose group of Silicon Valley tech capitalists, and several of them are very important figures in the Donald Trump camp, including David Sachs, another Silicon Valley oligarch who was nominated by Trump to be the White House czar for AI and crypto. So what all of this shows is that the United States has become more and more of an oligarchy controlled by a small handful of billionaire oligarchs who became insanely wealthy by establishing monopolies. Now, this certainly isn't new in the history of the United States. If you go back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, U.S. society was dominated by the robber barons. These were capitalist oligarchs who today would have wealth similar to people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. And they controlled the metalworking industries like steel and iron. They controlled the oil industry. They controlled the railroads and the coal industry. These were powerful capitalist oligarchs like John D. Rockefeller and Cornelius Vanderbilt. But what happened is in the progressive era of U.S. politics, the U.S. government passed antitrust laws and broke up many of these monopolies. And in recent decades, new monopolies have established that have become more and more powerful and control the government. And as Peter Thiel wrote in his Wall Street Journal article, this is an inevitable feature of capitalism. Even Karl Marx recognized it in the third volume of Capital back in the 19th century, that capitalism inherently tends toward monopolies, and if the government does not discipline and control the capitalist class and prevent the consolidation of monopolies, they will take control over everything, which is exactly what we've seen in the United States. As Peter Thiel pointed out, if you actually have competition, what happens is that over time, profits fall and they get competed away. In fact, Karl Marx wrote about this in the 19th century. He referred to it as the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. That is, that over time, as there's more competition, firms have to reduce their production costs lower and lower and reduce their profit margins. So what happens is that companies invest more and more in capital and they employ less and less labor. So there's less surplus value extracted from labor, which is the source of profits. Marx referred to this as the organic composition of capital. That is, over time, there's more and more investment in capital. Industries become more and more capital intensive, less labor intensive. As machines are used to automate the production process, profit margins become razor thin and they eventually disappear unless a company can establish a monopoly. And if a company can destroy all of its competitors, it can maintain monopoly profits. This explains why in China, which has a socialist system run by a communist party, but they have a socialist market economy, it's not completely planned like the Soviet Union. In fact, in many ways, China is following a more orthodox understanding of Marxism, going back to Marx itself, which understands that you have to have these market forces in order to push down profits, that this is an inherent part of the development of the productive forces in order to eventually develop socialism. China is following that, exactly what Marx wrote about in the 19th century. And what is happening in China? China has incredibly competitive internal markets with dozens and hundreds of different companies competing with each other. For instance, in the electric vehicle industry, there are dozens of different companies creating electric vehicles. And what happened? The cost of electric vehicles plummeted. These companies are producing EVs with razor thin margins. They're some of the best EVs in the world, and they're extremely cheap. They cost like 10,000 US dollars. Meanwhile, Tesla vehicles, because there's basically almost no competition in the US against Tesla EVs, so Tesla has a monopoly and they charge high monopoly rents, and their cars are 5 or 6 times more expensive than Chinese EVs. So the US government puts tariffs on Chinese EVs to prevent China from competing with US monopolies. And meanwhile, the Western financial press complains that in China, corporate profits are constantly falling. And they complain about deflation in China. But the reason that there's deflation in China is that the price of consumer goods continues to fall because there's so much internal competition. Because the socialist Chinese system actually understands the importance of having competition among corporations to prevent the creation of monopolies. But what China does is the government provides certain support for strategic industries, and it creates plans. So every 5 years, the Communist Party publishes a 5-year plan, and then the government publishes other separate plans for strategic industries. For instance, in 2020, they announced the plan for high quality development of new energy vehicles from 2021 to 2035. And the government provides incentives and subsidies and invests in infrastructure. And these companies compete according to the government plan. And then they bring profits down to zero and they create the best possible products for the lowest possible price. And now this is what China is doing in artificial intelligence. China is using its state-owned banks to provide very cheap loans to AI companies. So then AI companies will compete with each other to produce the best possible models, the best possible technological breakthroughs in research. So in US capitalism, what you get is large corporate monopolies that control everything. The government privatizes everything, sells them off to monopolies, and then they charge monopoly rents. Everything is insanely expensive, and the US can't produce anything because it's been deindustrialized and the economy's been financialized and controlled by Wall Street. In Chinese socialism, what you get is something completely different. The government has state ownership of the natural monopolies. So instead of allowing corporations, allowing capitalists to create monopolies, the Chinese government owns the banking system, the telecommunications infrastructure, the energy grid, metalworking, mines, infrastructure development. All of those industries are controlled by state-owned enterprises. But in other industries where China wants innovation, especially in technology, the government incentivizes competition among different companies to reduce the cost of production, to make the best possible products for the lowest possible price, preventing the creation of monopolies, whereas the US government is encouraging the creation of monopolies. These systems are complete opposites. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is what explains Washington's new Cold War on China. It is the US government's attempt to protect all of its corporate monopolies, to protect its billionaire oligarchs who fund politicians from both parties, and to destroy the Chinese socialist model and save the US capitalist model in the world. Because US capitalism cannot compete internationally with Chinese socialism around the world. But if it destroys China, then US monopolies can dominate the entire global market. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.